My boyfriend thought acting cold would make me obsessed with him. I introduced him to his replacement. Me and Jake had been dating for 4 months, and things started out amazing. He was sweet, texted me good morning every day, planned actual dates, and seemed genuinely excited to be with me. We'd stay up talking until 3 in the morning about everything and nothing. My friends kept saying I'd found one of the good ones. Then around month 2, Jake started acting weird. He'd take hours to text back when I could see him online. He'd cancel plans last minute saying he forgot he had other stuff to do. When we did hang out, he'd spend half the time on his phone and act like I was bothering him if I tried to talk. I thought maybe he was stressed with work or something, so I gave him space. But it just got worse. He stopped saying I love you back. He'd show up late to everything without apologizing. If I cooked dinner, he'd eat it while watching TV and not say thank you. When I tried talking to him about it, he'd shrug and say I was overthinking things. My roommate Becca said I should dump him, but I kept making excuses because I remembered how good things used to be. One Friday, Jake said he was having guys' night at his apartment. I wasn't invited, obviously, which was fine because I had plans with Becca anyway. But Becca got food poisoning an hour before we were supposed to go out, so I decided to drop off soup at Jake's for him and his friends since I'd already made a huge batch for Becca. I figured it was a nice girlfriend thing to do. I got to Jake's apartment and was about to knock when I heard my name through the door. Jake was talking loud enough that I could hear everything. He was telling his friends how he had me completely wrapped around his finger because he'd started treating me like crap. He actually said those words. His friend asked why he would do that, and Jake said he read online that girls want what they can't have. The less attention he gave me, the more desperate I'd get to win him over. He said I'd been cooking him meals and buying him stuff ever since he started ignoring me. His friends were laughing, and one of them said I must be really dumb to fall for it. Jake said it wasn't about being dumb, it was psychology or whatever. Girls think they can fix cold guys, and it makes them try harder. He said he could probably cheat on me at this point, and I'd blame myself. They all thought this was hilarious. I stood there holding the stupid soup while my boyfriend explained to his friends how he was manipulating me on purpose. He said the best part was I was so in love with him now that he could treat me however he wanted, and I'd never leave. His friend asked if he actually liked me at all. Jake said I was cool enough, but the power trip was honestly better than the relationship. I left without knocking, drove home, put the soup in the fridge, and called Becca to tell her everything. She was pissed even through her nausea. That's when we came up with a plan. I didn't break up with Jake. Instead, I became the girlfriend he pretended to want. I stopped texting him first. When he finally texted me, I waited twice as long as he did to respond. Sometimes I just left him on read. When he asked to hang out, I'd say maybe, and then confirm last minute like it didn't matter either way. I stopped cooking for him, stopped buying him things, stopped putting any effort into dates. Jake noticed immediately but tried to play it cool. The less I cared, the more he started doing. He actually showed up with flowers one day. I said thanks and put them in water without making a big deal. He started texting me more, trying to make conversation. I gave one-word answers. He asked if something was wrong, and I said no. Why would anything be wrong? But here's where it got good. I started hanging out with this guy from my economics class named Ryan. We were just friends, but Jake didn't need to know that. I'd mention Ryan casually in conversation, like how he said something funny in class, or how we grabbed coffee after studying. Jake started asking all these questions about Ryan. I'd shrug and change the subject. Then I started being busy when Jake wanted to hang out. Sorry, I already made plans with Ryan to study. Can't tonight. Ryan got tickets to this concert. Maybe another time. Ryan's having people over. Jake was losing his mind, but trying to act like he didn't care. He started showing up at places he knew I'd be. He'd see me laughing with Ryan and come over all territorial. I'd introduce them super casually, like Jake was just some guy I knew. Ryan played along perfectly because he thought the whole situation was funny. One night, Jake showed up at my apartment unannounced with takeout from my favorite place, trying to surprise me. Ryan was already there, sitting on my couch watching a movie. Jake looked between us and asked what was going on. I said we were hanging out. Was that a problem? Jake's face went red and he shifted the takeout bag from one hand to the other. Ryan stood up from the couch and walked over with his hand out. Jake stared at it for a second before shaking, and I could see his grip was too tight from the way Ryan's smile got a little forced. I kept my voice light and introduced them again, saying their names slow like I was talking to kids. Ryan said it was nice to meet him, and Jake just nodded without saying anything back. The apartment felt too small suddenly with all three of us standing there. Jake looked at the textbooks spread across the coffee table, then at the movie paused on the TV, then back at me. I walked over and took the takeout bag from his hands, thanking him and saying it smelled amazing. He asked what we were doing, and I said studying for our economics exam tomorrow. Ryan added that we had a huge test and really needed to focus. Jake's jaw was doing this twitching thing it does when he's trying not to get mad. I set the food on the kitchen counter and told Jake we really appreciated him thinking of us, but we had to get back to work. He asked if he could hang out and wait until we were done. I said maybe, but I'd text him later because I didn't know how long this would take. Ryan was already sitting back down on the couch and opening his laptop like the conversation was over. Jake stood there for another few seconds, and I could see him trying to figure out what to say. I walked to the door and opened it, giving him a smile that probably looked fake. He finally left, and I closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a second. Ryan looked up from his laptop and asked if I was okay. I nodded and came back to the couch. He said the whole situation seemed pretty intense to watch. I felt bad suddenly because Ryan was actually a nice person, and I was using him to make my boyfriend jealous. He asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said maybe a little. We talked for probably 20 minutes about the whole Jake thing. Ryan said he was happy to help, but he wanted to make sure I wasn't losing myself in all the game playing. I told him I knew what I was doing, but I appreciated him looking out for me. He said as long as I was sure, he'd keep playing along. We actually did study after that because we really did have a test the next day. Over the next few days, Jake wouldn't stop texting me. He'd send messages asking what I was doing, who I was with, if I wanted to hang out. I kept my answers short and waited hours before responding, even though I saw every message right away. He sent a long text about how he missed me and wanted to take me somewhere nice this weekend. He mentioned that restaurant I'd talked about months ago, the one he always said was too expensive. I read the message 3 times before responding. Told him I already had plans this weekend. He texted back immediately asking what plans. I said just stuff with friends from class. He asked if Ryan would be there, and I said probably, along with some other people. He sent back 3 question marks. I didn't respond to that. The truth was Becca and I were planning a girls' night because she wanted to watch some new show and eat junk food, but Jake didn't need to know any of that. I showed Becca the texts and she said he was completely losing it. She asked how long I was going to keep this up and I said I didn't know yet. Part of me wanted to see how far he'd go. Saturday morning, I was still in my pajamas making coffee when someone knocked on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw Jake standing there with flowers and a coffee cup from my favorite place. I wasn't expecting him at all, which made it easier to look unimpressed when I opened the door. He held out the flowers and coffee with this hopeful smile. I took them and said thanks. He asked if I wanted to do something today, maybe drive out to that hiking spot we talked about going to. I told him I really did have plans, and he should have asked me first before just showing up. He said he wanted to surprise me, and I said I don't really like surprises. His face fell, and he asked what my plans were. I said just hanging out with Becca and some other stuff I needed to do. He stood there looking at me in my old t-shirt and pajama pants like he was trying to figure something out. I thanked him again for the flowers and coffee and started to close the door. He put his hand on it and asked if something was wrong between us. I said no. Why would anything be wrong? He said I seemed different lately, and I told him I was just busy with school. He finally left, and I closed the door. Becca came out of the kitchen where she'd been watching the whole thing. She was trying not to laugh, and I could see her biting her lip. She said she couldn't believe how desperate he looked. I put the flowers in water and sat down at the table with the coffee he brought. Becca pointed out that 3 weeks ago I would have canceled everything to spend the day with him. I knew she was right. The power thing had completely flipped, and it felt good but also kind of sad. We both just sat there for a minute not saying anything. Then Becca asked what my actual plan was here, and I said I was still figuring it out. She said I needed to decide if I was trying to get revenge or trying to fix things, because those were 2 different goals. I told her I honestly didn't know anymore. Monday in economics class, Ryan had saved me a seat near the back. We worked on the problem sets together like we always did. I noticed one of Jake's friends were in this class, the guy who'd been at the apartment that night. He kept looking over at us with this weird, knowing expression. I wondered if Jake had been complaining to all his friends about me. The friend caught my eye once, and I just stared back until he looked away. Ryan asked if I knew that guy, and I said sort of. Class ended, and Ryan asked if I wanted to grab lunch. I said yes because I was actually enjoying spending time with him now, not just using him for the plan. We went to the sandwich place off campus and talked about normal stuff. He told me about his family back home and asked about mine. We talked about what we wanted to do after graduation. I realized I'd been so focused on all the Jake drama that I forgot what it was like to just have an easy conversation with someone. Ryan was funny and smart, and he actually listened when I talked, instead of checking his phone every 5 seconds. My phone buzzed while we were eating. Jake was asking where I was. I typed back that I was out with friends and hit send. He responded immediately asking which friends. I left him on read and put my phone face down on the table. Ryan noticed me smiling and asked if the plan was working. I said maybe too well. He asked what I meant, and I told him Jake was texting me constantly now, showing up places, bringing me gifts. Ryan got quiet for a second and then said he hoped I knew what I was doing. I said I thought I did, but honestly I wasn't totally sure anymore. He said he was still happy to help, but I should probably figure out my endgame soon. I knew he was right, but I didn't want to think about it yet. We finished lunch and walked back to campus together. My phone buzzed with another text from Jake asking what time I'd be free later. I put my phone away without responding. That night, I was in my apartment doing homework when my phone started ringing instead of just buzzing with a text. Jake's name showed up on the screen and I stared at it for a second, because he literally never called me anymore. Everything was always texts. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. He sounded different right away, kind of stressed and maybe a little desperate. He asked if we could talk about us, like really talk about where things were going. I could hear something in his voice that sounded almost vulnerable, and for half a second I almost felt bad. Then I remembered him laughing with his friends about how he had me wrapped around his finger. I told him I was really tired and had an early class tomorrow, but we could talk sometime this week when I was less busy. There was this pause on the other end, and then he said, "Okay," in this quiet voice that actually sounded hurt. I felt this weird twist in my stomach that could have been guilt, or could have been satisfaction at finally making him feel a fraction of what he'd put me through. I said goodnight and hung up before he could say anything else. The next day, Becca came home from her shift at the campus bookstore and immediately sat down next to me on the couch with this look on her face. She told me she'd run into one of our mutual friends named Sarah who'd mentioned that Jake had been complaining about me to people. Apparently, he was telling everyone I'd changed and become distant and cold for no reason. I felt this surge of anger because he was actually trying to make me look like the bad guy when he was the one who'd started all of this by deliberately treating me like garbage. Becca said Sarah seemed kind of confused about the whole situation because she knew Jake and I had been good together at first. I grabbed my phone and texted Sarah directly asking what exactly Jake had said. She responded pretty quickly and admitted that Jake had made it sound like I was being cold and pulling away for no reason at all. He'd told her he didn't know what he did wrong and I was just suddenly acting different. Sarah said she felt bad for him until I texted. I decided right then that I needed to tell a few close friends the truth about what I'd overheard at Jake's apartment. Not to trash him publicly or start drama, but to protect my own reputation since he was clearly trying to control the narrative. I texted 3 of my closest friends and asked if they wanted to grab dinner. We met at this pizza place near campus, and I told them everything. About overhearing Jake through the door explaining his whole manipulation strategy to his friends. About how he'd deliberately started treating me badly because he read online that girls want what they can't have. About him laughing with his friends about the power trip being better than the actual relationship. They were completely shocked. One of them actually put her hand over her mouth. Another one said she'd thought Jake's hot and cold behavior seemed kind of calculated, but she figured she was reading too much into it. The third one got really angry on my behalf and said she couldn't believe he'd actually planned it all out like that. It felt really good to have people validate that I wasn't crazy for being upset. They all said I should dump him immediately, but I explained that I was already working on something better than just breaking up. 2 days later, Jake sent me a long message asking why people were acting weird around him. He said Sarah had been kind of cold when he ran into her at the library, and a couple other people seemed like they were avoiding him. I played dumb and texted back that I hadn't noticed anything different. He pushed and asked directly if I'd been talking about him to people. I stared at that message for a minute and then typed back that he'd been talking about me to people, so maybe he should worry about his own behavior first. It was the most direct I'd been with him since I'd overheard that conversation at his apartment. He tried to call me right after I sent that, but I declined the call and left him on red when he texted asking what I meant. The next day, Jake texted asking if we could meet for coffee to talk things out face to face. I thought about it for a while because part of me wanted to just keep avoiding him forever. But Becca pointed out that wasn't really sustainable since we had the same friend group, and I'd probably keep running into him on campus. I was also kind of curious what he'd actually say if I gave him the chance. I texted back that I could do coffee tomorrow afternoon. He responded immediately with the time and place. When I told Becca about it, she made me promise to text her every 30 minutes so she'd know I was okay. I laughed and said that seemed a little paranoid, but she insisted. She said Jake had been acting increasingly desperate and she wanted to make sure he didn't do anything stupid. I promised I'd text her. I got to the coffee shop the next day, and Jake was already there sitting at a corner table. He stood up when he saw me and looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before. We sat down and he immediately launched into this apology about being distant lately. He said he'd been really stressed with school and work, and didn't realize how much he was neglecting our relationship. He talked about how much he cared about me and how he wanted to do better. The whole time he was talking, there was absolutely no mention of the manipulation strategy or the conversation I'd overheard. Nothing about deliberately treating me badly or reading online advice about making girls chase him. I just nodded and let him keep talking while I waited to see if he'd actually tell the truth or just keep lying to my face. When Jake finally finished his whole rehearsed apology, I looked right at him and asked if he'd been playing games with me on purpose. His eyes went wide and he looked genuinely surprised by the question. He denied it immediately and said he would never do something like that. I watched his face carefully and could literally see him trying to figure out if I actually knew something or if I was just guessing based on his behavior. There was this calculation happening behind his eyes, and it reminded me exactly why I was done with him. This wasn't someone who cared about me. This was someone trying to figure out how much damage control he needed to do. I didn't tell Jake what I'd overheard because I wanted to see how long he'd keep lying. Instead, I said I needed some space to think about whether this relationship was actually working for me anymore. His whole face changed and he looked panicked. He asked if I was breaking up with him and reached across the table like he was going to grab my hand. I pulled back and said I didn't know yet. I just needed time to figure out what I actually wanted. He started trying to argue and convince me we could fix things, but I stood up and said I had to go. I could feel him watching me as I walked out of the coffee shop. Over the next week, Jake tried absolutely everything to win me back without actually admitting what he'd done. He showed up between my classes with lunch from places he knew I liked. He offered to help with my assignments even though he wasn't in any of my classes. He texted me these long, sweet messages like he used to send at the very beginning of our relationship back when things were good. It would almost be touching if I didn't know for a fact that it was just another manipulation tactic. He was trying the nice guy approach now that the cold and distant thing had backfired on him. I kept my responses short and non-committal. Thanks for lunch. I'm good on the assignment. Appreciate the text. Ryan caught up with me after economics class one day and mentioned he'd noticed Jake watching us around campus. He said it seemed like Jake was monitoring how much time we spent together and where we went. I felt uncomfortable because I really hadn't meant for Ryan to get caught up in all of Jake's jealousy and paranoia. Ryan was a genuinely nice person who'd been helping me out, and now he was dealing with my ex-boyfriend basically stalking us. I apologized, but Ryan said he didn't mind helping. Then he asked again what my actual endgame was here. He pointed out that I'd successfully made Jake desperate and miserable, but I still hadn't actually broken up with him or moved on. I realized I didn't really have a clear answer. That night back at my apartment, I sat on my bed staring at my phone while Becca made popcorn in the kitchen. Ryan's question kept running through my head because he was right, and I hated it. I'd been so focused on making Jake feel bad that I hadn't thought about what came after. Making him desperate and confused felt good in the moment, but it wasn't actually fixing anything inside me. The hurt was still there under all the anger and strategy. Becca came in with the popcorn bowl and sat down next to me. She asked if I was actually going to break up with Jake or just keep him hanging forever. I picked at the blanket on my bed and admitted I was scared that ending things would feel like letting him win. Like he'd successfully messed with my head and then just walked away without consequences. Becca set down the popcorn and looked at me seriously. She said staying with someone who treated me like a science project wasn't winning either. I knew she was right, but it still felt wrong to just let him go after everything he'd done. In economics class 2 days later, I was packing up my stuff after the lecture when Jake's friend came over to my desk. I recognized him immediately as one of the guys who'd been laughing that night at Jake's apartment. My whole body tensed up, but he looked uncomfortable and nervous. He said he wanted to apologize for laughing during that conversation. I just stared at him and waited. He explained that he thought it was just normal guy talk and didn't realize Jake was actually seriously messing with my head on purpose. He shifted his backpack from one shoulder to the other and admitted that Jake had been spiraling lately. Apparently, Jake was obsessed with losing me and kept asking all his friends for advice on how to fix things. I asked what kind of advice they were giving him. He said mostly they were telling Jake to just be honest and stop playing games, but Jake seemed convinced he could win me back with the right strategy. The irony wasn't lost on me. I thanked him for the apology and left before he could say anything else. That weekend, there was a party at someone's off-campus house and Ryan invited me to go with a group from our class. I almost said no because I was tired of the whole social scene, but Becca convinced me I needed to get out and have fun. We got there around 10 and the place was already packed with people. I was talking to some girls from my history class when I saw Jake push through the crowd. He looked drunk and angry and he was heading straight for me. Before I could move, he was right in front of me demanding to know if I was hooking up with Ryan. His voice was loud enough that people around us stopped talking and turned to watch. I kept my voice calm and told him he was embarrassing himself. He grabbed my arm and asked again where Ryan was. A couple guys from the economics study group stepped between us and told Jake to back off. Ryan appeared from somewhere and put his hand on my back asking if I was okay. Jake tried to push past the guys to get to Ryan, but more people got involved and started pulling him toward the door. Someone said they were calling him an Uber. Ryan asked if I wanted to leave and I nodded. We walked back to my apartment and I felt shaky the whole way. I'd never seen Jake that aggressive before. Ryan walked me all the way to my door and asked again if I was okay. I said I was fine, but I wasn't really. I woke up the next morning to a long text from Jake. He apologized for his behavior at the party and blamed it on drinking too much and being stressed about school. He said he knew he'd messed up and he was begging for another chance. He'd do anything to prove he was serious about changing. He loved me and couldn't lose me. The text went on for several paragraphs and I read the whole thing twice. It was the same cycle I'd seen before. Bad behavior followed by apologies that sounded good, but never led to actual change. I didn't respond right away. I put my phone down and got in the shower and tried to think about what I actually wanted. The hot water felt good, and I stood there longer than usual, just letting my mind wander. By the time I got out, I still hadn't figured out what to say to him. Later that afternoon, I called my older sister because I needed to talk to someone outside of the whole situation. She lived 3 states away and had only met Jake once over video chat. I told her everything that had happened, starting with overhearing the conversation at his apartment. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a simple question. Did I even want to be with Jake anymore? Or was I just staying in this because I was angry? The question hit me hard because I'd been avoiding thinking about it directly. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt actually happy in this relationship, and I couldn't. Even before I knew about the manipulation, I'd been stressed and confused by his hot and cold behavior. My sister said I didn't have to have all the answers right now, but I should think about what I wanted instead of just reacting to what Jake did. After we hung up, I felt more confused than before, but also somehow clearer. That evening, Becca made dinner and we ate on the couch while watching some cooking show neither of us cared about. She said she'd noticed I'd been spending way more time with Ryan than with Jake lately. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Not just as part of the plan anymore, but actually choosing to hang out with him. I'd been looking forward to seeing Ryan and laughing at his jokes and telling him about my day. She asked if maybe I was developing real feelings for him. I put down my fork and said I didn't know. Everything was too complicated right now. But even as I said it, I knew she was right. The time I spent with Ryan felt easy and fun in a way that time with Jake never had. Even in the beginning, when things were supposedly good with Jake, there was always this edge of anxiety about whether I was doing enough or being enough. With Ryan, I just felt like myself. Ryan and I met at the library 3 days later to study for midterms. We found a table in the back corner and spread out all our notes and textbooks. We worked for a couple hours trading practice questions and explaining concepts to each other. During a break, Ryan closed his laptop and said he needed to tell me something. My stomach tightened because I could tell from his face it was serious. He said he liked me as more than a friend. He knew the timing was terrible and I was dealing with all the Jake stuff, but he wanted to be honest about his feelings. He didn't expect anything from me and we could keep being just friends if that's what I needed. I appreciated how direct he was being. I told him I needed to sort out my current relationship before I could think about anything else. He said he understood, and we went back to studying, but the energy between us had shifted into something I couldn't quite name. I spent the next 2 days thinking about everything, about Jake and the manipulation, and the person I'd become trying to get revenge, about Ryan and how different things felt with him, about what my sister had asked me. I realized I was done. Not because of Ryan, but because I deserved better than someone who saw relationships as power games. I pulled out my phone and texted Jake asking him to meet me at the campus coffee shop tomorrow afternoon. He responded within seconds asking if everything was okay. I just typed back that we needed to talk. He sent 3 more messages asking what about, and if he did something wrong and could we talk now instead. I didn't answer any of them. The next morning before I was supposed to meet Jake, Becca called me into her room. She had her laptop open and she looked upset. She turned the screen toward me and I felt sick. She'd been taking screenshots of Jake's social media posts and comments over the past month. In every single one, he was subtly trash-talking me while playing the victim. Posts about how hard it was when your girlfriend changed on you for no reason. Comments on his friends' posts about girls who played mind games. A whole thread where he talked about how he'd been nothing but good to me, and I was treating him like garbage. Becca said she'd started documenting everything a few weeks ago, just in case things got worse. She thought I should have evidence of how manipulative he'd been. I scrolled through all the screenshots feeling my hands shake. He'd been building this whole narrative online where I was the bad guy, and he was the poor boyfriend who didn't understand what he'd done wrong. I thanked Becca and told her I was definitely breaking up with him today. She hugged me and said I was making the right choice. I grabbed my jacket and headed out to meet Jake at the coffee shop with all those screenshots burned into my mind. Jake was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in, looking at his phone and tapping his foot against the chair leg. He looked up when I sat down and tried to smile, but it came out nervous and fake. I didn't smile back. I just put my bag on the empty chair and looked at him directly. He started talking immediately about how he was glad I wanted to meet up and how he'd been thinking about us a lot. I let him go on for maybe 30 seconds before I cut him off. I told him I knew about his manipulation strategy because I overheard him bragging to his friends that night at his apartment. His face went completely white, like all the blood drained out of it. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then he started making excuses, saying it wasn't like that, and I was misunderstanding what I heard. He said his friends were joking around and he was just going along with it. He didn't actually mean any of that stuff. I cut him off again and said I didn't want to hear more lies. I told him I heard every word he said about treating me like crap on purpose, and how the power trip was better than the relationship. He looked down at the table and his hands were shaking. He tried to reach across to touch my hand, but I pulled it back. He said he was sorry, and he didn't know why he said those things, and he'd been stressed and stupid. I just stared at him until he stopped talking. Then his whole face changed and he got angry instead of apologetic. He said I'd been playing games too by using Ryan to make him jealous. His voice got louder and people at other tables started looking over at us. He said I was acting like I was so innocent, but I'd been manipulating him just as much with all the Ryan stuff. I admitted that was true and I wasn't proud of it, but I pointed out that I only started doing it after discovering he'd been manipulating me for months. He actually argued that what I did was worse because I did it on purpose. I almost laughed at how he completely missed the irony. He said at least he didn't parade some other girl around to hurt me. I reminded him he literally told his friends he could cheat on me and I'd blame myself. He went quiet again, but I could see his jaw clenching. A woman at the next table was definitely listening to our whole conversation now. Jake noticed too and lowered his voice. He asked what I wanted from him and what would make this right. I said nothing would make it right, because I couldn't trust anything he said anymore. I told him we were done, and I didn't want him contacting me anymore, except for necessary stuff like getting his things from my apartment. He looked genuinely shocked, like he hadn't actually expected me to break up with him. His eyes got watery and he asked if I was serious. I said yes, completely serious. He said he loved me and he'd do anything to fix this. I told him if he loved me, he wouldn't have treated our relationship like a psychology experiment. He put his head in his hands and his shoulders were shaking. Part of me felt bad watching him fall apart, but another part wondered if this was just another manipulation. I was too exhausted to care which it was anymore. I stood up and grabbed my bag. He looked up and asked if we could at least talk more about this later. I said no. There was nothing left to talk about. I walked away and didn't look back even though I heard him call my name once. When I got outside the coffee shop, I took a deep breath and felt this weight lift off my chest. It was over and I'd actually done it. The next few days felt strange and uncomfortable. Jake and I had so many mutual friends, and we were in overlapping social spaces all the time. I saw him in the dining hall on Tuesday, and he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept. His friends were with him, and they all went quiet when I walked past their table. On Wednesday, I ran into him outside the library, and we both just nodded at each other without speaking. It was so awkward. On Thursday, one of his friends stopped me after class and said Jake was really struggling with the breakup. I didn't know what to say to that. I felt guilty even though I knew I'd made the right choice. That night, I told Becca about feeling bad, and she got frustrated with me. She reminded me that his feelings were not my responsibility, especially after everything he did. She said I needed to stop making excuses for him even now. She was right, but it was still hard to see him looking so miserable around campus. Our mutual friends were being weird too, like they didn't know whose side to take. Some of them asked me what happened, and I just said we broke up and left it at that. Ryan texted me on Friday asking if I wanted to grab coffee, and I said yes. We met at the same place where I'd broken up with Jake, which felt weird, but I didn't mention it. Ryan asked if I was okay after the breakup. I was honest and told him I felt relieved more than sad. He looked surprised and asked if I was sure. I explained that the relationship had been making me miserable for weeks, and ending it felt like finally putting down something heavy I'd been carrying. Ryan said he understood and he was glad I was doing what was right for me. We talked about keeping things as friends while I took time to process everything and figure out what I actually wanted. He said that sounded good, and he wasn't going anywhere. His understanding about it made me like him even more, but I was determined not to jump into another relationship right away. I needed time to be just myself without worrying about what some guy thought of me. We finished our coffee and walked back to campus together. It felt easy and comfortable in a way things with Jake never did. On Saturday, Jake's friend from the apartment conversation, the one who'd apologized before, messaged me on Instagram. He said he wanted to apologize again and tell me that Jake had been talking about how much he messed up. He said Jake admitted to all his friends that he'd followed some toxic online advice about making girls chase him, and now he realized it backfired completely. The friend said Jake kept saying he wished he could go back and do everything differently. I appreciated the apology but told him I needed space from anyone connected to Jake right now. He said he understood and he was sorry for his part in everything. I felt a little better knowing Jake was at least being honest with his friends now, but it didn't change anything for me. The damage was already done, and I wasn't interested in giving him another chance to mess with my head. I started focusing more on my classes and spent time with friends who weren't part of the Jake drama. It felt good to remember who I was before this relationship took up so much of my energy. Becca and I had movie nights 3 times that week and just hung out without talking about Jake at all. We watched dumb comedies and ate too much popcorn, and it was exactly what I needed. I also joined a study group for my hardest class, the one I'd been struggling with because I was too distracted by relationship stuff. The study group met twice a week, and everyone was really nice and focused. One girl named Sarah asked if I wanted to get lunch sometime, and I realized I'd been so wrapped up in Jake and Ryan that I hadn't made any new friends in months. I said yes, and we made plans for the following week. Slowly, I was rebuilding parts of my life I'd let fall apart. 3 weeks after the breakup, I ran into Jake at a campus event for one of the clubs we were both in. I thought about skipping it to avoid him, but Becca said I shouldn't let him stop me from doing things I wanted to do. So I went, and of course he was there. We ended up in the same conversation group during an activity and had to interact. It was brief and civil and awkward. Afterward, he asked if we could talk for a minute, and I almost said no, but decided to just get it over with. We walked outside and stood by the building entrance. He apologized again, and this time he seemed genuinely sorry instead of just trying to manipulate me into taking him back. He admitted he treated our relationship like a game and hurt me in the process. He said he'd been seeing the counselor at the health center and working on his issues. I told him I appreciated the apology, but it didn't mean we were getting back together or becoming friends. He said he understood and he just wanted me to know he was sorry. We said goodbye and went back inside separately. It felt like actual closure instead of just another manipulation attempt. Ryan and I kept spending time together, and I started noticing how different everything felt compared to my relationship with Jake. Ryan was consistent and honest about everything. He never played hot and cold or made me guess how he felt. If he said he'd text me later, he actually did. If we made plans, he showed up on time. He asked me questions about my life and actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. I wasn't ready to date him yet, but I felt grateful knowing what healthy attention looked like after months of manipulation and mind games. We studied together, got meals together, went to campus events together. It was easy and comfortable, and I never felt anxious about what he was thinking or whether he actually liked me. One night, we were walking back from the library, and he made a joke that made me laugh so hard I almost dropped my books. I realized I couldn't remember the last time Jake had made me laugh like that. Becca pulled me aside after one of our movie nights and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She said I stood up for myself without completely losing my cool or doing anything I'd regret later. She pointed out that a few months ago, I was making excuses for Jake's behavior, and now I was setting clear boundaries and putting my own well-being first. I thanked her for being there through all of it and for calling me out when I needed it. She said that's what best friends do. We hugged, and I felt this wave of gratitude for having someone in my life who genuinely cared about me and wasn't playing games. It felt good to recognize my own growth and see how far I'd come from that night standing outside Jake's apartment holding soup and listening to him brag about manipulating me. I wasn't the same person anymore, and I was proud of that. I scheduled an appointment at the campus health center the following week and filled out forms in the waiting room about my relationship history and current concerns. The counselor was a woman in her 40s who asked me to explain what brought me in, so I told her about Jake and the manipulation and how I'd handled it. She listened without judging and then asked me why I thought I'd stayed with him even after his behavior changed so drastically. I didn't have a good answer at first, just said I kept hoping things would go back to how they were at the beginning. She asked about my past relationships and my family, and we started connecting dots I hadn't noticed before. My dad used to give me and my mom the silent treatment when he was upset, sometimes for days, and I'd learned to try harder to make him happy instead of addressing the actual problem. The counselor pointed out that Jake's hot and cold behavior probably felt familiar in a weird way, like something I knew how to navigate even though it hurt. We talked about how people often repeat patterns from childhood in their adult relationships without realizing it. It was uncomfortable sitting there recognizing how much of my reaction to Jake came from old wounds I hadn't dealt with. The counselor gave me homework to journal about times I'd accepted bad treatment in other relationships and what I was getting out of staying in those situations. I left feeling kind of raw and exposed, but also like I was finally understanding something important about myself. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back, and we worked through a lot of stuff about my need for approval and my fear of conflict. She helped me see that walking away from Jake wasn't giving up. It was choosing myself, which was something I'd never really learned to do. About a month after the breakup, I got a notification that Jake had sent me a friend request on social media. I'd unfriended him after everything went down, but hadn't blocked him because I didn't want to seem like I cared that much. Seeing his name pop up on my phone made my stomach twist. I stared at the request for a while, trying to figure out what he wanted and whether I should accept it. Part of me was curious about what he was doing and whether he was dating someone new. Another part of me knew that staying connected would just give him a way back into my life, even if it was just through screens. I brought it up in my next therapy session, and my counselor asked me what I hoped to gain from accepting his request versus what I might lose. I admitted I was mostly curious, and maybe wanted to show him I was doing fine without him. She asked if I trusted his reasons for reaching out, and I realized I didn't. Jake never did anything without some kind of strategy behind it, and reconnecting on social media was probably just another way to test whether he still had any power over me. I told her I wanted to keep the boundary firm because I'd worked too hard to get to this point. She said that was a healthy choice and reminded me that curiosity wasn't worth sacrificing my peace of mind. I declined the friend request and felt this weird mix of relief and sadness, like I was closing a door I'd been holding open just in case. Ryan texted me a few days later asking if I wanted to go to a concert with him and some friends from his dorm. He made it super clear it was a group thing and not a date, which I appreciated because it took the pressure off. I said yes and met up with them outside the venue on Friday night. There were 5 of us total and everyone was friendly and excited about the band. We pushed our way toward the front and spent the next 2 hours dancing and singing along to songs I barely knew. I hadn't been to a concert in months because Jake always said they were too crowded and loud, which should have been a red flag since I'd mentioned loving live music on our first date. Being there with Ryan and his friends reminded me how much I'd given up trying to make Jake happy. Nobody was monitoring my behavior or making me feel like I was too much or too loud. I could just exist and have fun without worrying about someone's mood shifting because I was enjoying myself too much. During one of the slower songs, Ryan grabbed my hand and pulled me closer so we wouldn't get separated in the crowd. His hand stayed in mine even after we were clear of the crush of people, and it felt easy and natural instead of calculated. On the walk back to campus, we talked about the show and our favorite songs, and he kept holding my hand the whole way. It wasn't dramatic or charged with tension, just comfortable, like something that made sense. The next afternoon, Ryan and I grabbed coffee, and I told him I'd had a really good time at the concert. He said he was glad, and then got quiet for a second before saying he wanted to be honest about something. I braced myself for bad news, but he just said he appreciated my friendship and liked spending time with me, but he understood I wasn't ready to officially date anyone yet. I felt this wave of gratitude because he was saying exactly what I needed to hear without me having to explain everything. I told him he was right, that I was still working through stuff from my last relationship and didn't want to jump into something new before I was ready. He said he understood completely, and he was happy to keep hanging out casually while I figured things out. He didn't pressure me or make it seem like he was just waiting around for me to change my mind. His lack of pressure made me feel safer than I'd felt in any romantic situation in a long time. With Jake, everything had felt like a test or a game, like I was constantly being evaluated on whether I was worth his time. With Ryan, I could just be myself without strategy or performance. We finished our coffee and walked around campus for a while, talking about normal stuff like our classes and our families and what we wanted to do after graduation. It felt good to have easy conversations without worrying about hidden meanings or manipulation tactics. In my study group the following week, one of the girls asked me about my relationship status while we were taking a break from cramming for our biology exam. I opened my mouth to mention Jake and then realized I didn't automatically think about him anymore when someone asked that question. It caught me off guard because for months he'd been the first thing on my mind whenever relationships came up. I told her I was single and focusing on myself right now, and saying it out loud felt true, instead of like something I was supposed to say to sound healthy and independent. She nodded and said that was cool, and then started talking about her own dating life. The conversation moved on, and I sat there kind of amazed that I'd reached this point without even noticing. The healing had been happening slowly in the background while I was busy going to therapy and hanging out with friends and rebuilding parts of my life I'd neglected. I wasn't obsessing over what Jake was doing or whether he missed me. I wasn't checking his social media or asking mutual friends about him. I was just living my life, and he'd become this person I used to know, instead of this huge presence taking up all my mental space. Jake graduated at the end of the semester, and one of his friends mentioned he was moving back to his hometown for a job opportunity. Knowing he wouldn't be on campus anymore felt like closing a chapter, and I was relieved I wouldn't have to worry about running into him at parties or seeing him around campus. His friend pulled me aside after a group study session and said Jake had told him he learned a lot from how badly he messed up our relationship. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and said, I hoped he figured things out. Part of me wanted to be bitter and say he didn't deserve to learn and grow from hurting me, but mostly I just felt neutral about the whole thing. He was leaving and I was staying, and our lives were moving in different directions. That felt like enough closure without needing some big final conversation or dramatic goodbye. Winter break gave me space away from campus and everything that had happened over the past few months. I went home and spent time with my family and old high school friends who didn't know anything about the Jake situation. My mom commented on how relaxed I seemed compared to Thanksgiving when I'd been stressed and distracted. My sister said I was finally acting like myself again instead of the worried version of me she'd met over fall break. We stayed up late watching movies and talking about everything, and she told me she'd been concerned about me during those months but hadn't wanted to overstep. I admitted I'd been in a bad relationship and had to work through a lot of stuff to get out of it. She hugged me and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything and how much stronger I seemed now. Being home with people who knew me before Jake reminded me of who I was outside of that relationship. I'd spent so much energy trying to win him over and then getting revenge that I'd almost forgotten I had an identity separate from all that drama. When spring semester started, Ryan and I met up for coffee during the first week back. We caught up on our breaks and talked about our new classes, and then he brought up the conversation we'd had before winter break. He asked if I'd thought any more about what I wanted regarding us. I told him I'd been working through a lot of my trust issues in therapy over break, and I felt ready to try dating him if he was still interested. He smiled and said he'd been waiting for me to be ready, which made me feel both grateful and a little guilty that he'd been patient for so long. We agreed to take things slow and communicate honestly about everything, instead of playing games or making assumptions. He said he wanted to know if something bothered me instead of me just pulling away or acting cold. I promised I'd be direct with him and asked him to do the same. It felt good to start something with clear expectations and honest communication, instead of all the manipulation and mind games I'd dealt with before. Our first real date was completely different from anything I'd experienced with Jake. Ryan planned an afternoon at this art museum I'd mentioned wanting to visit months ago, which meant he'd actually been listening when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. We walked through the exhibits and he asked me questions about which pieces I liked and why, genuinely interested in my answers. He wasn't on his phone or distracted or acting like spending time with me was some kind of favor he was doing. When we stopped for lunch afterward, he told me about his family and his plans after graduation and asked about mine. The conversation flowed easily without any awkward silences or power dynamics. I kept catching myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to suddenly turn cold or distant or start playing games, but he stayed consistently kind and present the whole time. On the walk back to campus, he held my hand again, and it felt natural like it had at the concert. I realized I wasn't performing or strategizing or trying to figure out his hidden agenda. I was just enjoying spending time with someone who actually seemed to like me for who I was. Becca pulled me aside after one of our movie nights and said she wanted to tell me something. I got nervous thinking she was going to say she was worried about me rushing into things with Ryan, but instead she said she could tell I was genuinely happy, instead of just pretending to be happy like I sometimes did with Jake. She said I seemed lighter and more like myself, laughing easily and not constantly analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. I asked her if she approved of Ryan, and she said absolutely, that he seemed like a good person who treated me well and made me smile without any games or manipulation. She pointed out that a few months ago I'd been making excuses for terrible behavior, and now I was in a relationship where I didn't have to defend or justify anything. I thanked her for being there through all of it and for calling me out when I needed it. She hugged me and said that's what best friends do, and I felt this deep gratitude for having someone in my life who genuinely cared about my well-being without any agenda. It felt refreshing to just enjoy someone's company without strategy or defense mechanisms, both with Ryan and with Becca. I wasn't constantly on guard waiting for people to hurt me or use me. I could just exist and be myself and trust that the people around me actually liked that person. A few months into dating Ryan, I got a message from Jake that I wasn't expecting. It popped up on my phone while I was studying in the library, and seeing his name after all this time made my stomach flip for a second. The message was long and said he'd been going to therapy since we broke up, working on his problems with wanting to control people, and how he treated relationships like some kind of game he needed to win. He wrote that he wasn't asking me to respond or trying to get back together, just wanted me to know he understood how badly he messed up and took full responsibility for hurting me on purpose. I read it twice. sitting there with my economics textbook open in front of me, and realized I didn't feel angry or sad or anything really. I appreciated that he was working on himself and actually acknowledging what he did instead of making excuses, but I had zero interest in reopening that door or continuing any kind of conversation with him. I closed the message without responding and went back to studying, and it felt good to recognize that his apology was for him to feel better, not something I needed to participate in. Spring break came around and Ryan asked if he could come home with me to meet my family. I was nervous about it because my sister knew everything about the Jake situation, and I wasn't sure how she'd react to me bringing someone new around so soon. But Ryan met my parents at dinner the first night and they loved him immediately, asking him questions about his major and his family and his plans after graduation. He answered everything thoughtfully and asked them questions back, genuinely interested in getting to know them instead of just trying to impress them. My sister pulled me into the kitchen while we were cleaning up and told me she could see how different this was from when I'd talk about Jake, how I seemed relaxed and happy instead of stressed and anxious all the time. Later that week, my mom caught me alone in the living room and sat down next to me on the couch. She said she remembered how worried she'd been when I was with Jake, even though I tried to hide it, because I seemed like I was always walking on eggshells and second-guessing myself. With Ryan, she said, I seemed more like myself, laughing easily and not constantly analyzing everything. It meant a lot to hear that the people who knew me best could see how much healthier things were now, and I felt grateful to have their support and approval. Back at the school after break, I had a therapy session where I realized I hadn't thought about the whole manipulation and revenge thing in weeks. I'd been so focused on my relationship with Ryan, my classes, and spending time with friends that the Jake drama just wasn't taking up space in my head anymore. My therapist pointed out that this was actually a really good sign of healing, when you stop defining yourself by the bad thing that happened and start building new positive experiences instead. She said a lot of people get stuck replaying the trauma or the revenge, but I'd managed to move forward and create something good without letting the past control my present. It clicked for me in that moment that all the time I'd spent being angry at Jake and planning ways to make him feel bad had actually been keeping me connected to him in a weird way. Now that I'd let go of that and focused on Ryan and my own life, I felt lighter and more free than I had in a long time. One night, Becca and I were hanging out in our apartment, just eating pizza and watching bad reality TV like we used to before all the drama started. She asked me if I ever regretted how I handled things with Jake, using Ryan to make him jealous and playing the same games he'd played with me. I admitted I was glad I stood up for myself instead of just letting him keep treating me badly, even though my methods probably weren't perfect or the healthiest way to deal with it. Becca said what mattered was that I learned from the whole situation and didn't let Jake's behavior make me think I deserved to be treated like that in future relationships. She pointed out that a lot of people would have just blamed themselves or made excuses, but I recognized the manipulation and refused to accept it. We grabbed a couple of drinks from the fridge and toasted to growth and making better choices, and I felt this deep appreciation for having a friend who'd supported me through everything, without judging me for how I handled it. Things with Ryan were going really well until we had our first real fight about something stupid. He wanted to go to his friend's party on a night when I'd already made plans for us to have dinner with some of my classmates, and we both got frustrated trying to figure out the schedule. My immediate reaction was this wave of anxiety that he was going to turn cold and distant as punishment for disagreeing with him, just like Jake used to do whenever I had a different opinion. I could feel myself starting to shut down and pull away, already preparing for him to ice me out for days. But instead, Ryan just said we should talk about it and figure out a compromise that worked for both of us. We ended up going to dinner with my friends and then heading to his friend's party after, and the whole thing was resolved in like 10 minutes. Afterward, I told him about my fear that any conflict would turn into manipulation or emotional punishment, and he looked genuinely sad that I'd been conditioned to expect that. He promised me that disagreements were normal, and healthy people work through them together instead of using them as weapons. It was such a small thing, but it showed me what a real relationship was supposed to look like. As the semester wound down and finals approached, I found myself looking back on the past year and barely recognizing the person who used to make excuses for Jake's terrible behavior. I'd learned to trust my gut when something felt wrong, to set clear boundaries about how I wanted to be treated, and to spot manipulation tactics before they could really take hold. More importantly, though, I'd learned what genuine care and respect actually looked like in a relationship through being with Ryan. It wasn't about grand gestures or intense passion that burned hot and cold. It was about consistency and honesty, and treating each other like actual partners instead of opponents in some power struggle. I aced my economics final, the same class where I'd first started hanging out with Ryan, and it felt like closing one chapter and opening another. Jake's friend from economics class, the one who'd apologized for laughing during that awful conversation, stopped me after our last class of the semester. He mentioned that Jake was dating someone new and apparently treating her really well, like he'd actually learned something from how badly he screwed up with me. I waited for the bitter feeling to hit, the anger that I had to be the lesson he learned from, but instead I just felt genuinely glad he was growing and not repeating the same patterns with someone else. Later in therapy, I told my counselor about it, and she said that perspective, being able to feel good about his growth without resentment, showed how much I'd healed and moved forward. She pointed out that a few months ago I would have been angry or hurt, but now I could separate his journey from mine and recognize we were both better off apart. Ryan and I were walking back from the library one night, talking about summer plans and what classes we'd take next semester, when he stopped and turned to face me. He said he was falling in love with me and wanted me to know, even though it hadn't been that long and he didn't want to pressure me. Instead of feeling scared or skeptical like I might have before, I realized I felt exactly the same way about him. I told him I loved him too, and it felt earned and real instead of like the rushed, intense feelings I'd had with Jake that were more about drama than actual connection. We were building something based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than games and power dynamics, and that made all the difference. He kissed me right there on the path, and I felt completely sure about us in a way I'd never felt with anyone before. A few days later, Becca came running into our apartment screaming that she'd been accepted to this amazing summer program abroad that she'd applied for months ago. I was genuinely excited for her, jumping up and down and hugging her while she showed me the acceptance email. She'd been there for me through everything with Jake, supporting me and calling me out when I needed it, and helping me see that I deserved better. She joked that she could leave for the summer knowing I was in good hands with Ryan and wouldn't fall for any more manipulation tactics from random guys. We both laughed, but I knew she was right. I'd learned way too much to ever go backward into that kind of toxic situation again. The experience had taught me what to look for and what to avoid, and I was grateful for that even though it had sucked going through it. A full year after breaking up with Jake, I looked around at my life and could barely believe how much had changed. I was doing well in all my classes, actually enjoying school instead of being distracted by relationship drama all the time. Ryan and I had been together for months and it just kept getting better, built on a foundation of trust and communication instead of manipulation and games. Most importantly, though, I developed this strong sense of my own worth that didn't depend on anyone else's validation or approval. I knew what I deserved in a relationship and I wasn't willing to settle for less anymore. The whole experience with Jake had taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't some elaborate plan to make someone feel bad. It's just living well and refusing to let their toxicity define your story. I was happy and healthy and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, and that felt like the best possible outcome. And that's the full story. I love finding the little lessons in moments like this. If it helped you see something differently, that's a win.